Hello, and thank you very much for joining us for this event, which is part of the public program supporting the exhibition Samurai. The exhibition will be open until 4th of May. My name is Satona Suzuki, and I'm a senior lecturer in Japanese and modern Japanese history at SOAS University of London. My connection to the samurai is quite personal as well as professional. From a very young age, I encountered samurai through manga, anime, TV dramas, films, and also books and visits to historical sites. And I also work on samurai in the late Tokai period, around 1850s, just before their social class was dismantled. So both personally and professionally, the samurai are very close to my heart. So it is a great pleasure to chair this panel discussion today. We have here as Oleg Benesch, professor and head of the Department of History at the University of York, Matt Alt, co-founder of Alt Japan, a Tokyo-based company specializing in localization of many things. They'll each give a short presentation followed by a discussion moderated by me. So first, Oleg will speak about samurai in popular culture before the 1950s or 60s. Thank you, Oleg.
Thanks so much, Satona. 150 years since their abolition as a social class in Japan, the samurai survive today as an immediately recognizable, truly global icon. They're an element of Japanese popular culture consumed in other countries, while television, video games, comics, and toys produced outside of Japan also frequently borrowed samurai imagery and themes. And some of the largest collections of historic samurai armor, swords, and related objects are found in Europe and the United States, and samurai exhibitions will often draw large audiences. Within Japan, samurai are often widely invoked to attract both local and foreign tourists through museums, castles, and other heritage sites, such as here in Shimane Prefecture. And famous historic warriors are celebrated as symbolic representatives of many regions across the country. And at first glance, this range of developments might be seen simply as the recent globalization and commodification of an ancient and purely Japanese tradition. In fact, from their very origins, the samurai were influenced by developments beyond Japan's borders, especially China and Korea. And furthermore, the samurai soon became known outside of Japan, first through their successful repulsion of the Mongol invasions in the 13th century, and later through their devastating invasions of Korea in the 1590s, as well as emigration to Southeast Asia and journeys as far as Europe in the early 16th century. Now, the evolution of the samurai has always been influenced by external factors, and the samurai have in turn had a dramatic effect on views of Japan in other societies. Through these dynamics, the samurai have become a global icon in a way that few other regional or national figures have matched, save perhaps the image of the European knight that has attained similar levels of global recognition. So in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to discuss the longer history of the samurai, focusing on how they became cultural and then pop cultural icons in the 20th century, where Matt will pick up this story. I will start with a brief overview of samurai history before the abolition of the samurai in the late 19th century, before moving on to the reinvention and use of samurai imagery in the last 150 years. Now, the most influential figures in later representations of the samurai began to appear in the 11th century. The conflicts of the 11th and 12th centuries, especially the Genpei War of the 1180s between the Taira and Minamoto families, are seen as some of the most important early samurai engagements, and they were widely recorded in the popular war tales in the following centuries. In the exhibition at the British Museum, we show many paintings, woodblock prints, and other items that celebrate these early heroes, many of whom continue to be household names in Japan today. Already at this very early time, though, warriors were conscious of their own image and are commissioning works of art to detail their exploits, or swords and armor that were made in particular styles to emulate those worn by their famous predecessors. The founding of the Kamakura shogunate around 1185 has often been portrayed as the formative moment for the establishment of the samurai as an important and significant military force, juxtaposed with the imperial court in Kyoto. In actuality, warrior power grew more gradually over the 150 years of the Kamakura period. In 1333, the Kamakura shogunate collapsed, and there was a brief attempt to restore imperial power, but by 1336, the new Ashikaga shogunate established itself in Kyoto, and warrior rule was not threatened for the next 500 years, even if the warriors themselves contested it fiercely between one another. By the late 15th century, Ashikaga power was being increasingly threatened by other warlords, and the long 16th century is often referred to as the Warring States period, or Sengoku. While Japanese warfare in the 11th century had often focused on small elite bands of mounted archers, by the 16th century armies had grown much larger, often including thousands or even tens of thousands of foot soldiers armed with pikes and other weapons. The arrival of firearms from Europe in the 1540s further changed the battlefield, and the second half of the 16th century saw the consolidation of authority by ever more powerful warlords, especially the succession of the so-called three unifiers, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. The widespread warfare of the decades before 1600 became another great source of heroic figures and inspiration for later stories and popular culture, as many more warlords joined the pantheon of famous samurai that are still known in Japan today. Now, the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate under Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1603 and the elimination of resistance to the new order in the first decades of the 17th century had major implications for the samurai. The Tokugawa codified samurai status, and they defined their status above the other social classes. Even as Japan moved from a period of conflict to one of peace, warrior status was clearly defined for the first time in Japan's history. Warriors now wore two swords as symbols of their status, and they were generally mandated to live in the castle towns away from their lands in the countryside. The shogun's capital, Edo, present-day Tokyo, was the largest castle town and possibly the largest city in the world around 1700, with more than 1 million inhabitants. In many ways, the beginning of the Edo period saw the domestication of the samurai and their conversion from warriors into bureaucrats and other types of civilian professionals. The Tokugawa peace placed the samurai in a difficult, if privileged, position. Warriors in a period without war, the samurai were for all practical purposes administrators rather than fighters. And we can see this here. This is a woodblock print from the exhibition of some samurai acting as land surveyors. Let's see a little detail here. The lack of military necessity made many samurai consider their roles in society and to try to justify their elite status, but there was little consensus among them. This is complicated by the fact that there was considerable diversity within the samurai class, and many of them were unemployed or just scraping by. In addition, there was a certain view that samurai were an elite, but there was no kind of way of the warrior or other widely accepted or coherent samurai ethic. As the Tokugawa age progressed, samurai looked increasingly to two sources for models of behavior and virtue. One of these was ancient China, and the other was pre-Tokugawa Japan. Among the Japanese sources, the most prominent stories included the war tales of the 12th and 13th centuries, as well as narratives of great warlords of the 16th century. These were reinvented and reproduced through countless cultural forms, from woodblock prints to plays to novels and more. Samurai featured very heavily in kabuki theater, with many plays based on historical events and famous warriors. These actors and tales were then depicted in many popular woodblock prints, giving them even greater reach, and this samurai content was eagerly consumed by all classes of society, not just the warrior elite. In comparison, the tales of the 16th century were often more localized, referring to the ancestors of specific domains and their exploits on the battlefield, even if these were heavily idealized and only recorded decades after the events in question. For samurai living through the peaceful Tokugawa age, a pronounced nostalgia for a time when they could have sought glory and honor on the battlefield is not surprising. The Tokugawa shoguns presented the Minamoto clan, victorious in the 12th century civil war, as their progenitors and thus legitimizers of their own rule. At the same time, the pre-Tokugawa centuries were also the period when the status of warriors was most in flux, and most directly influenced by foreign objects, encounters, and ideas. During the early 17th century and beyond, warlords commissioned opulent folding screens to express their inheritance at home, and they dispatched suits of armor and screen paintings overseas as diplomatic gifts, which proclaimed the bravery and fighting prowess of Japanese warriors. Ceremonial armor experienced an antiquarian trend with the recreation of medieval great armors. Armor production then undergoes a further shift from the practical towards the decorative, and similarly, swords were the almost exclusive prerogative of the samurai and thus comprised important status symbols, often with fine fittings made from precious materials. The stability of the Tokugawa order is undermined finally in the 1850s, and in 1853, an American fleet began the process of opening Japan. The inability of the samurai government to face the foreign threats led to its collapse in 1868 following a brief civil war. Although the later popular image would indicate that the country was covered with massive fortresses filled with fearlessly loyal warriors who would choose death over surrender, the course of the Civil War challenges this myth. While there were a few isolated fierce battles, the vast majority of castles surrendered with little or no resistance, and the war was over quite quickly, especially when compared with the US Civil War of the same decade. The bloodless surrender of Edo Castle by the shogunate is representative of the conflict. The new government then placed the Meiji Emperor in power after almost 800 years of samurai rule, had rendered emperors little more than figureheads. In spite of being an ostensible return to tradition, the beginning of the Meiji period was defined by wholesale modernization and westernization processes that shook the whole country. Japanese students and experts were sent to the West to study, while foreign advisors were brought in on an unparalleled scale. The Meiji government quickly established a modern army consisting of conscripts rather than samurai, many of whom struggled to adapt to the new order. As many samurai feared, the abolition of the old warrior government was followed by the elimination of samurai stipends and special status, including the privilege of wearing swords. Popular sentiments towards the samurai in the 1880s were often negative, and many texts criticized samurai behavior, or, more commonly, dismissed it as a relic of the bygone age. By 1890, however, Japanese attitudes towards the past had begun to shift. Part of this is generational, as memories of the Tokugawa period had dulled in the past 20 years, and most Japanese no longer had meaningful memories of the samurai order. At the same time, there was a growing Western fascination with all things Japanese, and this increasingly extended to samurai swords and armor, which were purchased in large quantities by collectors. One example is Prince Henry of Bourbon-Parma, the Count of Bardi, who traveled to Asia in the late 1880s and bought more than 3,000 objects that he shipped back to Italy, where they are now the core of the collection of the Oriental Art Museum in Venice. Japanese objects are one of the most prominent parts of the collection, including many samurai armors and weapons. These here are two paintings of himself that Henry had made while he was in Japan and that are now in the collection, and that which are now on display in the British Museum as well. Also in Italy, around the same time in Florence, the Anglo-Italian businessman Frederick Stibbert added almost 100 samurai armors to his vast collection of medieval European weapons, and these are now displayed in one of the medievalist great halls he built for this purpose. And the British Museum exhibition has several loans from this collection as well. In the 1880s, as Westerners were collecting Japanese swords and armor, there was still extensive criticism of the samurai back in Japan. In textual sources, this negative view remained strong until the 1890s. However, the appreciation of material culture and art based around the samurai, as well as their rising profile in the West, combined with the passage of time to make possible a symbolic rehabilitation of the samurai and other feudal symbols, inspired by developments throughout the Western world. And this transition can be seen specifically in the reinvention of the concept of bushido, which certain key thinkers exhumed from forgotten texts and proposed as a native Japanese equivalent of English gentlemanship specifically. Around 1890, some Japanese intellectuals cited the Victorian view that traced English gentlemanship back to medieval chivalry, and proposed that, like England, Japan had also had a feudal knighthood, the samurai, which could serve as a reference for a native gentlemanship. They called this ethic the way of the samurai, or bushido, which, bushido was a very obscure term at the time, but it soon grew to become a household word in Japan and abroad. This is part of a process by which people in Japan rediscovered their own pre-modern past as a source for a modern national identity. Samurai symbols were linked to the modern state, especially the modern military that was seen as the heirs of the samurai warriors. This connection developed rapidly after victory in the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. It also changed significantly at this time. As an ethic based on the samurai warriors, the martial elements of bushido were brought to the fore after the war, as the new bushido focused on self-sacrifice, patriotism, and love for the emperor. Bushido then became a key pillar of the emperor-centered state ideology during and after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, a role it would fulfill until the end of the Second World War. Japan's victory over Russia is the first time the samurai became a global icon. And having kind of attained global recognition, however, popular interest in Bushido and the samurai saw a sharp decline from around 1914, although they would experience a resurgence in the militaristic propaganda of the 1930s. Before and during the Second World War, the samurai became symbols of Japanese strength in the countries allied with Japan, as we can see in these materials here from Germany and Italy. So on the left, we have a poster from Boccasile, an Italian kind of propaganda artist, of a giant samurai astride the ocean, about to smash British and American ships with his sword. And we see kind of the German Nazi, the Japanese, Imperial Japanese, and then the fascist Italian flags in the background. On the right, we see an image from the 1930s this is a German image of a German kind of knight, but he's wearing very much kind of the military uniform as the helmet from the 1930s in Germany, and then a samurai, and they're facing off the kind of communist serpent that is threatening them. So this is how, kind of allies of Japan at the time are portraying Japan and the samurai. Conversely, those countries that are then at war with Japan saw the samurai as evidence of Japan's supposedly militaristic nature, which is much more negative in these portrayals. We can see this in these cartoons from Punch magazine from 1939 and 42, where in the image from the left, we see kind of the stylized John Bull representing Britain, who's trying to kind of negotiate with this samurai representing Japan, who's on the table. Then on the right, we see the kind of American eagle there in 1942, kind of harassing this samurai in this small boat. Now, the use of samurai imagery by Japan's enemies in the Second World War was most pronounced in the United States, and the focus on the samurai was even more pronounced in American propaganda than it was in Japanese materials. The disconnect between Japanese and American views could be seen especially in the propaganda film Know Your Enemy, Japan, which is commissioned by the US War Department and produced under the direction of the famous Hollywood director Frank Capra. The film included a substantial amount of samurai-related content that it reflected American expectations, and one of the main aims of the film was to convince Americans that modern Japanese soldiers were animated by a samurai spirit. The Imperial Japanese Army could only have wished that their own propaganda would have been so effective. After Japan's surrender in 1945, many people in Japan understandably rejected the samurai as symbols of the nation, as Japan moved towards what promised to be a more peaceful and democratic future. During the US occupation of Japan that lasted until 1952, symbols of militarism such as samurai films and martial arts were banned, while tons of samurai-style swords produced by the military in the 1930s and 1940s were sunk in Tokyo Bay by the Americans. Many other swords made their ways to museums and private collections as souvenirs taken by Allied soldiers, and we have examples of these in the exhibition. By the early 1950s, however, Japan's distant samurai past came to be seen as a place of refuge and escape for a country coming to terms with defeat and occupation. The pre-modern warriors seemed to offer an alternative masculinity that was safely removed from the excesses of the imperial state that collapsed in 1945. This shift could clearly be seen in post-war architecture, as the US Army had decreed soon after the war that former military areas be converted to house schools, universities, parks, and cultural institutions. Many Japanese garrisons had been located in former samurai castles, and local authorities turned to these sites for regeneration through heritage and tourism. For those cities that had lost their castle keeps due to bombing in the war, Reconstruction was seen as an important symbolic step in their post-war recovery. Other cities, which had lost their castle keeps in the modernization processes of the 1870s, were similarly enthusiastic to rebuild their keeps. Not wanting to be left out, many cities that had never had castle keeps at any point in history decided that this was clearly a case of better late than never and joined the castle building boom. The 1950s and 1960s saw an unprecedented flurry of castle construction, all of which was done from steel-reinforced concrete, and most of which was done with little regard to historical accuracy. Also in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a rapid growth in samurai films, most famously the works of Akira Kurosawa. Films such as Seven Samurai and Yojimbo received critical acclaim and global success. In many of these films, the figure of the samurai was much more nuanced than in more idealistic pre-war tales of loyalty and self-sacrifice. The samurai were often troubled and problematic figures living in a violent age. These figures resonated not only with Japanese audiences in the early post-war years, but also with people in many other countries. Samurai films directly inspired many cowboy films produced in the 1960s, transplanting the narratives from Japan to the American West, from samurai to cowboys. In this way, Seven Samurai became the Magnificent Seven, while Yojimbo was reinvented as a fistful of dollars. The inspiration wasn't limited to Westerns, however. In Kurosawa's 1958 film, The Hidden Fortress, starring Toshio Mifune, the lone samurai being escorted on his mission by two bumbling peasants, almost 2 decades later, in 1977, The Hidden Fortress inspired another film with a very similar theme, set in a somewhat different context, and I'll leave it to Matt to talk a little bit more about this.
Thanks, Oleg. What an absolutely great handoff to the next section of this talk, in which I would like to explore the ways in which samurai have been portrayed in Western media. Now, the way that most Westerners interact with samurai content is not through the lens of history, it is through entertainment, as opposed to the Japanologists of times of old in the era of Japanism, of the Victorian era, when people were traveling directly to Japan to acquire samurai implements or art related to samurai. Most people in the modern era encounter samurai through the lens of things like films, things like video games, things like comic books. And that is why I am here today. I have for many years, and even to an extent today, worked as what is known as a localizer. A localizer is someone who adapts content from one language and one culture so that it can be consumed smoothly in another culture. I specialize in translating and adapting Japanese content for English-speaking audiences. And a great deal of the material that we have handled over the quarter century and more of our existence has revolved around samurai and that samurai-adjacent favorite of the ninja. My work as a localizer gave me a sort of front row seat in what I think of as Japan's fantasy industrial complex. And Japanese fantasies have come to play an outsized role in diplomacy and in many spheres in the post-war era. I, in addition to localization work, also write. With my wife, Hiroko Yoda, I authored a book called Ninja Attack that pulls together myths, history, and legends of samurai and ninja as seen from the Japanese side. And more recently, I wrote a book called Pure Invention: How Japan Made the Modern World, which explores how Japanese products transformed us as we consume them, and how we, as global citizens, especially in the advanced world, have come to resemble Japanese audiences in many ways, demographically, economically, even politically to an extent. And that is going to have a great role to play in the conversation that we're going to be having about samurai and pop culture going forward. So Oleg handed this off to me very well. The origins of samurai in the popular imagination in the West originated with the films of Akira Kurosawa, which were then further interpreted by filmmakers in Italy and elsewhere into cowboy westerns. However, arguably, the single most influential portrayal of the samurai in pop culture is the 1977 film Star Wars, directed by George Lucas, who is a noted pal of Akira Kurosawa. Lucas and his cohort of new wave filmmakers were deeply influenced by the work of Kurosawa, and Lucas actually traveled to Japan in the years he was developing Star Wars before he began shooting to explore special effects techniques that he might use in his film and to talk to heroes to him, such as Akira Kurosawa. Now, it might seem a little bit funny to think of Star Wars as a samurai film, but when you look at it closely, the parallels and the homages are too many to ignore. The armor of Darth Vader closely resembles that of a samurai in many ways, with the black lacquer. The lightsaber battles are an obvious homage to the katana battles often seen in Japanese samurai films. And it's important to remember what Japanese call samurai films in Japanese. They call them jidai geki. Jidai meaning period and geki meaning drama. The name of the Jedi in the Star Wars is derived from the jidai geki that gave George Lucas such inspiration in making his film. Now, it's important to remember that Lucas's incorporation of these themes and elements into his work did not happen in a vacuum. A year before Star Wars hit the screens, a book by James Clavell by the name of Shogun became a bestseller around the world. Clavell's book is an amazing historical, thinly fictionalized historical drama. He learned about Japan the hard way in a prison camp during World War II, undoubtedly interacting with a lot of people who thought of themselves as real-life samurai, and after the war delved deep into Japanese history to come up with this drama that centered on a British sailor who had washed up in Japan after a shipwreck by the name of William Adams. This is an actual real person from history who was fictionalized in Shogun under the name William Blackthorne. In 1980, Shogun became what we would call today a prestige television series. And it aired first in America and then all over the world to great acclaim and great success, bringing samurai and their warlords and the era of warring states in which Shogun is set into living rooms around the world. The Shogun of this era is quite different from the Shogun that was later shown in 2024, and we're going to get into the differences there very shortly. But perhaps the most important of which is that Shogun of 1980 is told almost entirely through the lens of Western observers. Most notably Blackthorne, played by Richard Chamberlain, who is the fictionalized version of William Adams, the sailor who really did wash up on Japanese shores during this time in history of the late 1500s and educated the Japanese about things that were happening abroad and Western naval techniques and all sorts of things. Shogun was the very first time most Americans had this much of an in-depth view into Japanese history and to Japanese archetypes, such as shogun and samurai, that were portrayed in a way that wasn't so much propaganda, but portrayed more as history. It was actually filmed in Japan, and it starred many, many, many top-level Japanese talents. However, in almost every scene, there is a foreigner, either Blackthorne or someone else, who is standing in as an avatar for the viewers abroad. And the portrayals of the samurai, while they might be rooted in a more historical sort of inflection than earlier versions, are portrayed in a very quite brutal fashion. Shogun of 1980 was very much the Game of Thrones of its era. It was bloodier. It was more violent. It was more sexualized than anything that had been seen on certainly American TV to that point. And it was really quite shocking. I remember even as a young boy encountering this. I was only about 7 years old when this aired in the United States. The shocking violence and sexuality that you saw in the portrayals of the Japanese samurai. And as to why these scenes played out the way they did, and why Shogun portrays samurai the way they did, it's of course due to James Clavell's novel, and I'm sure a lot of that is informed by his experiences during World War II, but is also due in large part to the era. The 1980s were a period of great friction between Japan and advanced democracies and advanced countries around the world. Japanese products were disrupting industries in America, England, and many other places, most notably in consumer electronics and the automotive industry. Even in the most gentle portrayals of this, Japan was said to be invading foreign markets. And as a young child, it was not at all uncommon for me to turn on the TV and see imagery of ostensible adults smashing Japanese products or protesting Japanese companies and all sorts of publicity stunts designed to try to get Japanese out of Western markets. You couldn't even really escape this in pop culture. At the other side of the screen, you can see a still from one of my favorite movies, Blade Runner. It's a 1982 film by the director Ridley Scott, set in the far-flung year of 2019 Los Angeles. But it's not a Los Angeles that we would recognize today. It's a very Tokyo-fied Los Angeles, a place where English is a second language and where imagery of geisha and Japanese products is prominent on buildings all over the city. This is an era known as Japan bashing, where portrayals of Japan were almost universally seen as negative, and we young people were told that our futures lay in the hand of these faceless Japanese salarymen, white-collar workers, whose companies were going to take over the world. Now, you might think that for a young person such as me, raised in this era, that I would have come to have very negative feelings about Japan as well. However, I did not. And the reason for that is very simple, because to us, Japan was always the place of fantasies. It was the source of all of the things that we came to know and love in our own play lives. Transforming toys, video games, new forms of heroes, new styles of portrayals of masculinity and femininity. Japan to us was never an enemy. It was always the source of everything that we desperately craved. And this inflected the way that we came to see Japan, and it inflected the way that we would come to see Japanese entertainment as well. For instance, in the 1980s, there was also a huge boom for samurai and ninja-related pop culture among children as well. Most popularly, it was seen in the world of indie comic books. Comic books like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, who were described as ninja, but one of them at least, carries a samurai sword. Usagi Yojimbo, who is a rabbit samurai, a ronin to be exact, in the mold of a Kurosawa-type hero. And the popularity of these forms of entertainment spawned many, many, many imitators, some of which you've heard of and some of which you haven't, like Samurai Penguin. But samurai were a constant presence in children's entertainment of the era. However, they were portrayed more as heroes to us than the sort of rapacious, dangerous way that they were seen in the adult world. However, this being said, there were definitely adults out there who were studying the samurai in a different way. The salaryman, the Japanese white-collar office worker, was seen as a new breed of white-collar worker, and many Westerners abroad began to study the Japanese business system to see what it was that made Japan tick and made it so competitive abroad. Many of the analyses of Japan were inflected through the lens of martial arts and samurai. Miyamoto Musashi, who was a name virtually nobody knew in the West, had written a book called The Book of Five Rings in the Edo era. This was a book about martial arts and philosophy and self-growth and actuating your potential. But in the 1980s, it was rediscovered by business people who read it to try to divine what it was that was driving the Japanese economic miracle. So we see samurai playing a role both on television screens and playrooms and also in boardrooms. There is a word for how the image of a country can change as much as our image of Japan changed from the immediate post-war era to the Gen X and beyond eras where we see Japan as a very sort of positive force in the world. And that is soft power. Soft power is a corollary to hard power. We all know what hard power is. It is the use of force to compel someone to do what you want, to control them. If you won't do what we say, we will send in the tanks. We will send in the bombers. That is hard power. Soft power is something different. It is about making the other side want the same outcome you do because they like you. They like the things you make. They like your values. They like what you represent. And Japan has soft power in spades, thanks to all of the fantasies it has exported over the decades. Things like manga, things like anime, things like video games and toys that were consumed by young people starting in the 80s, only accelerating through the 90s and today. And they have fundamentally transformed the way that people all over the world see Japan. You can see this change in this sea change in the way that audiences view Japanese samurai most clearly in the aughts with the debut of a movie called The Last Samurai. The Last Samurai was set in the 1800s in a period where Japan is rapidly modernizing, but not all of Japan has modernized yet, and not everyone is on board with the way that Japan is modernizing. The samurai are rapidly being delegitimized. They're being stripped of their titles. And The Last Samurai is set in a very real era, but it is extremely fictionalized. A lot of people get confused about this. Tom Cruise is not the last samurai. He is somebody who is sent to Japan to educate Japanese people and help them modernize their military forces. This is actually a very real job description of the late 19th century. Oyatoi gaikokujin, or foreign advisors who were hired in all sorts of fields to help Japanese doctors modernize, to help the Japanese government modernize, and also to help the Japanese military modernize. The Last Samurai portrays the samurai in a much more nuanced way than Shogun of 1980 had. They aren't violent for violence's sake. They aren't nearly as brutal. They are portrayed as brave warriors. They are shown as possessing a philosophy that Westerners and Japanese seem to be losing or have entirely lost as they have modernized. So this is a completely different sort of portrayal, a much more sympathetic portrayal of samurai than we had seen in the West at any real point up until this time. This paved the way for 2024's reboot of Shogun. You're probably aware of this. It was a huge hit in America from the FX channel and then broadcast all over the world. But this version of Shogun was quite different from that of 1980. It recentered the protagonist from a foreign person to the Japanese themselves. Most of the dialogue is in Japanese. And most interestingly, the Japanese participants, the actors and actresses, were given unprecedented leeway in advising how the samurai and their setting and their language, even their clothing would be portrayed. So while Shogun of 2024 is still a Western production based on a Western book, aired on a Western channel, it is very much more a co-production or a situation where the Japanese have been given a lot more agency to show how they were portrayed on screen. The nominal star of Shogun, played by Richard Chamberlain in 1980, is played by a gentleman named Cosmo Jarvis in 2024. The exact same character, but whereas Richard Chamberlain's masculine, heroic, swashbuckling character in the 1980s, in 2024, Blackthorne is a sort of hapless character. He's carried along by this culture that he doesn't quite understand, and he's very much a secondary character in the story that plays out, which makes a lot of sense. Back in the era of warring states, he was one foreigner among a nation of Japanese who were going about their own politics, their own lives. Of course, a Westerner would be a sort of decentralized sort of role in that time period. So Shogun shows us a samurai drama that is perhaps a little more as the Japanese might see it. And I think it's actually really important to keep in mind that the Shogun of 2024 isn't necessarily more accurate. What it is more in keeping with the way that Japanese people tend to portray their own era of warring states, the way that they portray their samurai, and the way that they see their history. So this is a really interesting shift. We've gone from, in over the course of 40 years, from a portrayal of Japan that had to be mediated by Caucasian eyes, that had to be mediated through a sort of Western idiom, to a Japan that is now increasingly more quote unquote authentic, less mediated by Western tastes and more mediated by Japanese ones. The reason that this flies in the modern era is specifically because of what I was talking about earlier with soft power. As we consumed so many products from Japan over the decades, its anime, its manga, we've sung on its karaoke machines, we've listened to its Walkmans, we played on its Game Boys. As we consumed these Japanese fantasies, they transformed us and they brought us more in line with Japanese tastes, especially as our own societies came to resemble Japan in many ways. Because of this, young people now demand a more authentic Japanese experience in their entertainment and their products. And Japan as a whole has come to be seen less as a threat and more as a solver of modern problems. Whether it's clutter, whether it's finding yourself, whether it's trying to be happy, Japan is no longer this enemy. Japan is no longer this rival. It's seen as a partner or even an aspirational sort of presence on the global scene. And that is a huge shift. And we see that that shift plays a role in almost every sphere of our interactions with Japan, whether it is in politics or whether it is in pop culture like samurai movies like Shogun. And that's it. Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Okay, thank you so much for both Oleg and Matt for thought-provoking presentations. We have learned that the image of samurai evolved all the time, from a historical figure in Japan to a global cultural icon, and that this evolution was closely associated with Japan's position and its relationship vis-a-vis the West. So I have a couple of questions for you both, and then followed by move on to a more sort of specific one for both of you. So these questions are for both of you. So is the global image of the samurai today something Japan is exporting or something being co-created between Japan and the West? So whichever likes to answer first.
No, that's a really good question. I mean, Matt obviously touched on that quite a bit towards the end, and I mean, I think it is converging. It's very interesting, much more so. And I would say that, I mean, one of the things there is a lot of these things are obviously being produced. A lot of things that Matt mentioned, I think it's key to highlight. You know, and just to stress again, that includes video games. If it's like, you know, Ghost of Tsushima or Assassin's Creed or things like that, these are not being produced in Japan. These are being produced by Western studios, if they're French or American or wherever else they may be based. And then they're often going back to Japan. And, you know, sometimes these things succeed, do really well. I think Ghost of Tsushima, for example, did really well. Sometimes they don't do that well. And I think that was maybe the case with the Keanu Reeves film. Was it 47 Ronin, was it called? About, you know, 10, 12 years ago, which then, you know, I don't think did that well in Japan. That kind of influenced it. What I would say is, which is quite interesting, is you know, we had these kind of parallel discourses on Japan, in Japan and in other countries. And I didn't, for example, touch on China. I mean, there's a completely different discourse about the samurai in China that goes on from the early 20th century onward. But although these things are converging a bit, which of these and whether they're closer to a historical reality before that, I think is a different question. I think people are kind of maybe converging a bit more on the samurai that they want to see and the Japan they want to see, perhaps, whether that actually reflects what was going on 150 years and more ago.
Right.
So.
No,
What do you think,
that's
Matt?
really well put. I think actually what we're seeing right now is not so much more of a divergence, but that people abroad have come to appreciate the way that the Japanese portray the samurai themselves. And we are seeing this more and more in video games, as you mentioned, Ghost of Tsushima, Ghost of Yotei. These are entirely Western studios that are deeply, deeply influenced by samurai films, things like Shogun, I'm sure, Japanese history, and they endeavor to make these products as authentic as possible, to the point where most of their dialogue is in Japanese. The voice actors are Japanese. The settings are completely Japanese. When I use that word authentic, I'm going to again stress this. It doesn't necessarily mean accurate. What it means is that it is authentic to the Japanese pop cultural experience, because that's the shared lingua franca here, pop culture. And I think as more and more Japanese pop culture is exported all over the globe, we're going to see more of this sort of synchronization happening, not just in the samurai sphere, but in other ones as well.
Okay, great. So, and then from a sort of audience perspective in the West or outside of Japan, so when they watch samurai stories, how aware do you think they are that this is like a sort of constructed image rather than a historical reality? You see, it's authentic or, reality, whatever it is. Does that awareness even matter?
Yeah, Matt, do you want to start on that one?
Well, what I would say is that I think that most people watching this do not have. By this, let's just say let's pick Shogun 2024. I don't think most viewers have a deep grounding in Japanese history, so they are going to be taking it to a certain degree, that it's being spoken in Japanese, it's being acted by Japanese people. They are going to view it through a lens of a perceived reality that may or may not 100% map to what actual reality was. The Japanese have been creating characters out of their history for a very long time because they have had a very active, very literate populace since the 1700s, and arguably a kind of mass media since then in the forms of printed books, kabuki plays, and things like that. Samurai and ninja as well have been incredibly popular characters. They're arguably among the first popular characters that Japan began packaging and merchandising. So it's really interesting to see they have a history that's almost longer than many of the long running characters that we think of in the West, and that plays a role in this too.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
I might just add to that. I mean, there is, well, people in Japan will tend to know a lot of these figures, and that these, if it's someone like Minamoto no Yoshitsune, they will know this figure, the 47 samurai. Everyone's familiar with that to a much greater extent than in other countries. But I think that's also shifting. The people who are interested in Japan in other countries, whether they're coming through through video games, through martial arts, through whatever else, they're becoming much more knowledgeable about these things, and you can access that information now. So, I mean, I'm always amazed. My students, I teach, the history of Japan here in York in the north of England, and when my students come in, they will often have so much knowledge about 16th century warlords from various games that they've played, and and sometimes they will write dissertations about some of these things, which I mean, these are things that wouldn't, I think, have been thinkable 20 or 30 years ago. But they're, for people who want the knowledge, there's so much more information out there, and I think as Matt says, I mean, these things have been, this is something that's been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, and this is always part of this pop culture. It's just much more accessible today.
Yeah, it's the wonder of the internet, isn't it? Okay,
Yes.
great. So I would like to ask some specific questions for Oleg, if that's okay. So you explained that we touched on a bit, but if you could expand a bit, but explain that image of samurai has been shaped through interaction between Japan and wider world, and how did those interactions change what the samurai came to represent over time, particularly in moments like the late 19th century when samurai fascination with, Western fascination with samurai swords and armor began to grow? So was that like the part of the wider Japanism phenomenon, or is it completely something else, you think?
No, thanks. I think that's very accurate. I mean, it's part of this kind of Japonism movement, the celebration of Japanese art and culture that happens in the late 19th century, especially in Europe, also in the United States and such. But I think it's also tied in. This is something I've written a bit more on. So I mean, just very briefly, is on this the celebration of especially the medieval past and kind of knights and chivalry that's going on around Europe, but also in the United States at that time in the 19th century. If we think about the Houses of Parliament, for example, in London, which are built in a very kind of Gothic, medieval-looking style in the 1850s, right? And or the Tower Bridge, for example, and things like that. And people are celebrating this medieval past in Europe and the United States. And in Japan, they seem to see kind of a mirror of that. And they seem to see that the samurai are a mirror of kind of European knights, and maybe they also have this code of chivalry that they live by. And I think what that allows then Europeans, it's very attractive for Europeans who are then able to say, oh well, the European experience of like kind of progress through these civilizational stages and the medieval period into the modern, that this is a universal thing because Japan is going through this same model, and that seems to almost justify kind of the European place or the Western place in kind of civilizational hierarchies as they are seen in the late 19th century. And for people in Japan, this is also very attractive because it's people in Japan say, oh, we're on the same kind of pathway to modernization and power, but we can do it much more quickly than the West because we can learn from the Western model. The West, it took them 400 years to kind of figure all this stuff out. We can do it in like 40 years. And that seems to then be borne out by something like the First the Sino-Japanese War, but especially the Russo-Japanese War, where Japan defeats, one of the largest empires in the world at that time in 1905. And people are amazed by this. Britain is a very close ally of Japan at the time. Japan is being celebrated. And people are saying, well, this can't just be, technology or weapons or training. There has to be more to this because Japan is just, these tiny islands. And then we have Russia, this giant empire. And so they say, oh, well, it must be something about like the spirit or the culture. And that's when people start focusing kind of on the samurai. And I think that's then the first time the samurai really become a global icon in many Western nations, because they're seeing kind of also this threat from Asia as well. Some are celebrating it, some seeing it more as a threat, but also in the rest of the world, and especially in colonized countries, that it's being celebrated in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in South Asia, Latin America. People are celebrating this kind of non-Western nation finally defeating one of the Western powers, and then that's a very aspirational thing. So
yeah, amazing. Yes. And then come Second World War, you mentioned that samurai imagery was quite sort of strongly sort of portrayed in US propaganda. For you mentioned Frank Capra's films, but at the same time, like ideas like bushido were also present. It was kind of revived, sort of new bushido, I think you mentioned. So how do we make sense of that? Are these connected or different use of the same symbol?
yeah, it's a really good question. It's a really difficult period in a sense that I think in other countries, as I showed some of the German and Italian examples, but also the United States, I mean, it's quite easy to kind of portray Japan as this land of samurai, living according to this kind of code of self-sacrifice and loyalty. Within Japan, it's actually quite a bit more complicated because, I mean, the most important kind of bit of the ideology of the imperial state until 1945 is the focus on the emperor and the imperial house. And that there's a tension between that and the samurai, because historically the samurai displayed very little loyalty towards the emperor, the imperial house, with a few kind of exceptions who were then used very prominently, like Kusunoki Masashige, this kind of 14th century warrior who has a big statue still in front of the imperial palace in Tokyo. But the focus within Japan and the Japanese military in terms of spiritual education and such was much more on kind of the imperial family and the nation, rather than the samurai. There was a tension there. And although it was used a lot, I mean, Japanese officers were issued with samurai style swords from the 1930s onward. We see it in educational materials. But it's not quite as extreme as I think one might expect and what we see in other countries. I mean, that poster I showed of the by the Italian artist of this giant samurai smashing British and American ships. I've never seen anything like that produced in Japan. I couldn't imagine a Japanese artist kind of producing something along those lines at that time. So yeah, the use of these things are quite different.
Yeah. Oh, great answer. Thank you so much. Can I move on to Matt now? Are you ready, Matt?
I'm always ready, like a samurai.
Oh, great. So I think it's very interesting that you said that for a long time, many Western samurai stories are told through a lens of a foreign protagonist, but more recently, we're sort of seeing stories told from more sort of Japanese perspective. So I think you mentioned this, but mentioned the soft power and things, but is it driven more by changing Western audience tastes or by Japan representing itself more directly to global audiences, or more broadly a part of the recent phenomenon of decolonization?
Yes. To all of those questions, I think the big backdrop here is that Japan's trajectory as a advanced nation, as an industrial society, presaged a lot of what happened in the outside world. Japan got to the future in a lot of ways ahead of the West in terms of transitioning from an industrial to a service-based economy, in terms of its economic miracle collapsing in 1990 and ushering in decades of economic stagnation. And this, because of this experience, the products that Japan started to make answered questions that the West hadn't thought to ask quite yet. And that's what gave them such novelty and such charm to audiences around the world. And as I was saying, as we consumed those, we came to resemble the audiences who they were initially made for in Japan in many ways. The Western society, and especially millennials, zillennials, many of the trends that we now associate with them first manifested in Japan in the 1990s, decades before they did in the West. So there's arguably a kind of Japanization going on of young people in particular all over the world. Against that backdrop, decolonization, striving for more diversity and more diverse casting choices and more perhaps authentic or accurate ways of portraying other cultures have become the norm as opposed to exceptions as they were, I think, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And Japan as a whole has become much less of an exotic sort of presence in the lives of young people in particular. Most young people today are raised on things like Pokemon. They're raised on things like anime that feature samurai or samurai-like characters in them. Certainly things like katana and armor feature prominently in all sorts of anime series. And then video games, as the sort Oleg was talking about, the Ghost of Tsushima, the Ghost of Yotei. These allow people to actually become samurai and experience a Japanese world through their virtual avatar on the screen. So you see many of these sort of cultural flows merging, and samurai entertainment, the portrayal of samurai as they're seen in the West, is one very interesting reflective facet of this change in global culture.
Amazing. Since you're a localizer, I'm dying to ask you this question. It's kind of maybe a little bit more personal, if that's okay.
Sure.
So when you're like trying to localize samurai themed content for Western audience or markets, are you trying to stay authentic, or are you trying to sort of shape it to meet audience expectations? Do you see what I mean?
Well, like the answer to that,
what tends to change in that process as well?
Sure. No, it's a great question. It's I think a lot of people mistakenly believe that localizers make these decisions when they are translating and adapting content for foreign audiences. But the truth of the matter is, localizers are one cog in a bigger fantasy machine. They work in concert with the stakeholders that created the content, the director or the writer, the producer, and the decisions about how to portray things abroad are made together with those stakeholders. So it's often the Japanese side who are asking for changes to be made for the content to be consumed in a smoother, easier way.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. That's quite educational, actually, because didn't know much about that. But yes, yeah, it's very great question. Sorry, not questions. I asked great questions, right? Great answers from both of you. And I think I have to ask a very, very quick last question. Who is your last samurai? For both of you.
Ooh, the last samurai. Well, actually, I'm gonna somewhat dodge that question because actually, as Matt was speaking, I was thinking about it, and it never really occurred to me that that could actually be plural, that film title. This might be
Right.
a very basic observation, but it's obviously not Tom Cruise, but it's also
Yes.
not his counterpart. It's kind of all of the samurai. This was like the end of the samurai, and
Right.
the rebellion in 1877 that's fictionalized there. That is often seen as kind of the end of the samurai in a lot of ways. So yeah, can the last samurai be all of them? I don't know.
That's why, certainly, it's funny because Hiroyuki Sanada, who plays a role in The Last Samurai as the right-hand man of Ken Watanabe's ostensible Last Samurai, is then the Shogun in 2024 Shogun. So you see this kind of through line through all of this. I love all of these films. Authenticity to me is secondary to entertainment. And as long as it's done in a respectful way, I love seeing artists play with history. So bring it on. The more the merrier, I say.
I totally agree. And more reason for me to watch Last Samurai 2020. Anyway, yes, thank you very much for both of you. And thank you very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the panel discussion as much as we did. So the Samurai exhibition is open until 4th of May. So please do go and check it out for yourselves if you can. It's very highly recommended. Thank you so much.